Hey everybody, and welcome to Backcountry Baking. Today we're going to be talking about how to bake in the backcountry. First, my name is Charles. I am the coordinator for outdoor recreation here at Recreational Services at the University of New Mexico. Why baking outdoors? Well, one, if you just love to be outdoors, I think that adding baking to your skill repertoire and to your dining experience outside is going to enhance that experience. And it also gives us some unique opportunity for flavor and to add nutritional value to our backpacking and outdoor experience. So first, a couple of things that I wanted to talk about was tools that you would need in order to kind of get going. So initially, you really you need a stove. You need proper utensils. And equipment and a good recipe and things like that. So I'm going to show you what we use here at the Outdoor Adventure Center. Everything that I'm going to show you today, for the most part, you can rent from us, including this Knowles cookery, which we will go into here in a second. And these are some of the tools, or around the same tools, that I would use in my own backcountry baking. In a past life, I was a baker for about 2 years. I don't necessarily think that makes me a better baker than your average home baker. I just think it might give me a leg up when it comes to yeast spreads and things like that, and knowing when things are done, for sure. So today I'm going to show you guys. This is the Whisper Light International. This is the stove that we have for rent here at the Outdoor Adventure Center. One thing I like about it, this takes white gas, but it can also take kerosene. So it is a multi-fuel stove. It's really easy to work with. The temperature control on it is excellent. It is very sturdy. Has a great base, but it also has, I love these little ridges right here because it really grips onto your pots and other baking dishes and things like that. So there's that stove. Always good to have some sort of typically, I'll always have, I may just take my fry bake here, which I'll go into here in a second, but the Alpine Two Pot Set from MSR is a go-to standard. This thing's great. You can bake in this, baked in this plenty of times, especially making cakes and things like that, or small cakes, or steaming some, steam baking some muffins or cupcakes or something like that. And it also comes with this nice lid that serves as a fry pan as well. So if you need to make, depending on how fancy you are, you can make your glazes or compotes or jellies and jams or whatever for the side in the lid there. And this guy works for the sake of today as a great mixing bowl. So we're going to start there with that. The next item that I'm going to talk about is the fry bake. This one is brand new. We have some of these here. We use these actually just in our trips program, so you can't rent these. If you watch this and you really wanted to borrow one, I would work with you on that. So you can just let me know. The Banks Fry Bake. This is the Expedition Edition, and I'll kind of talk about that a little bit. One of the things that I love about this is that you can season this just like a cast iron pan at home. So right now this is the brand new smooth finish, but these guys are fantastic and just rock solid. They are a little bit on the heavier side, so they do have an Alpine version, which is much lighter but is also smaller, and then they have an Alpine deep dish that's actually my go-to. I have a small family at home. There's usually just 2 of us to 3 of us out when we camp, so making things bread-wise this size, we might have some leftovers for the morning, which is not a bad thing, but for the most part I use my Alpine deep dish that you can find on the, if you just search Banks Fry Bake, and I'll put a link to that on the, either below here in just a second when I edit the video, or I'll also send it out in the email for the participants of the class today. So the fry bake, you'll notice kind of it's very close to like a cake pan. It does have these nice angled sides. It's really great. You can get a spatula down there really quickly, or a fork, or whatever you happen to have. You can get that down there really quickly, and to be able to check on, say, pizzas or cinnamon rolls and things like that. I mentioned seasoning it. Once it gets nice and seasoned, things tend to stick less. But you know, greasing a pan is important no matter where you're baking. So, or flouring it, depending on how you like to bake your breads. Another thing that I like about this, the Expedition version, it's got this nice little wing nut up here. Depending on the kind of baking you're doing, you can actually, brand new. Anyway, you can loosen this guy, maybe. Here we go. Use our pot grips. You can loosen this guy. The Expedition version has this nice little wing nut right here, and these are the pot grips that Frybake sells as well, and I'll kind of talk about those here in a second too. So this wing nut up here is great. You can loosen it, and it actually helps to vent. So depending on what you're baking, if there's a lot of liquid and things like that in there, and you don't want that to make a soggy, moist bread, depending on like pizzas and things like that, you want that steam to be able to escape so that the pizza bakes evenly, and you don't get that doughy kind of top that you'll get sometimes if you have a bunch of liquidy toppings on there. But also, if you're baking anything if you're steaming anything, it helps to kind of regulate that without you having to take off the entire lid. Another thing that I love about that, we'll talk about Twiggy Fires here in a second, but it has a nice, like, good half-inch indentation there on top for making a nice little Twiggy Fire or getting it going up here. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. I cannot brag on these Frybakes anymore. I think they run about 80 bucks. So if you wanted to buy one brand new, one thing that's great, if you go to the Banks Frybake website, small mom and pop shop out of the Northeast somewhere, but they do a fantastic job, and their customer service is excellent as well. Let's see, another really important thing is to have a good mixing spoon. This is the size that I would normally take with me on my trips anyway. This is the GSI Cascadian set. They do work really well in this for a great mixing spoon, and it's tablespoon size, so it does really good dollops for dropping any kind of, like, if you're saying biscuits or if you're doing drop donuts or something like that. And it also comes with knife and fork, which for me, the knife and the fork are really important, especially when we talk about the fork's good for when we talk about testing our breadstuffs to make sure that they are finished. You can also use sticks and things, but we'll talk about that here in a minute. Fuel bottle goes with the stove. Oh, a measuring device. The Nalgene, or any water bottle that is clear and that has a measuring guide on the side there, I think is really important. All right, so now that we've talked about the tools that we need, let's talk about some of the techniques. First, we're going to talk a little bit about safety. So when I'm baking, or when I've got my camp kitchen going, I'm the only one allowed in there. I can have somebody else at a distance doing prep, but it's not as like home where it's a place of congregation, and I love to have like a 10-foot radius while I'm cooking, because I don't want anybody coming through my cook area. We're talking about playing with fire and fuel. It's very important to establish your cook zone and to make sure others are aware of it and that they're kind of abiding by it. Again, having somebody else there with you doing prep or attending to it, but it needs to be clear conversation of like, hey, I'm stepping away, can you just watch it for a little bit until I come back, and then relieve that person again. I know it sounds a little strict, but we're talking about flammables and things like that. Forest fires are real, burns are very real, and that'll end a trip very soon, very quickly. want to make sure, so we're going to talk a little bit about leave no trace principles. So we want to make sure we're utilizing a very durable surface. Right now we're inside, so we have this nice concrete ground, but that could represent sand, it could represent a rock surface or something like that. Riverbanks are great, gravel beds or gravel bars, those kind of things are excellent when it comes to having a nice durable surface. However, say we're in a grassland or in an upland meadow or something like that, the Whisper Light comes with a piece of really just thick aluminum or some sort of metal here, but that guy right there creates a good base, and it's not going to scorch the ground below. So even if you do create a hot space, and depending on if it's windy or not, we have our lovely windscreen right here, and we just encapsulate that. One thing you'll notice is it's starting to look like an oven. So if I put my fry bake right there on top, I've got my nice windscreen all the way around. It is really creating a nice oven-like environment for whatever we're trying to bake. Another one of the leave no trace principles I want to talk about is the planning ahead and preparing. So kind of knowing the regulations before you go, so you make sure you can abide by them as best as possible. Some places are only going to allow you to have backpacking stoves, and the 2-burner, which we have up here as well. They may not allow you to have a campfire, they may not have ready-to-go fire rings and things like that. So making sure that you have everything you need prior to setting out for the weekend or week-long or day trip is really important. And again, using a durable surface to cook on is the best method possible. And it's always a good idea to to cook away from camp. Don't cook directly in camp, especially when we're talking about being in an environment that has bears and things like that, and depending raccoons and critters that just want to get in, that aren't necessarily violent, but they just want to mess things up and get in, and we create habit zones for animals to expect food to be in those zones, and it creates issues with other visitors and animals. We just want to make sure that we're cooking away from our campsite as much as possible, especially in the backcountry. To give maybe, I don't know, 100 feet, 200 feet, 100 to 200 feet away from your campsite. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is cooking techniques. The first one that I'll talk about is called technique is kind of the Tower of Power. And kind of the thought process behind that is that, so we have this one heat source that is directly underneath the pot, and ideally, you would have a broad heat source, especially for baking, that it would spread the heat out, and that's kind of the goal that we're trying to get to. So when I do my baking, if I use the Tower of Power method, I will rotate it. So say the recipe calls for a, say, 30-minute bake time. Every roughly 7.5 minutes, I am rotating it, and think of it as in quadrants or thirds, depending. So if I'm baking, I've got a pizza baking in here, and I want to make sure it bakes evenly, I'm going to set this up to where it is in the, we'll say this is we have quadrants, right? So we're in the first quadrant here. In 7.5 minutes, I'm going to rotate it to hit that second quadrant. And again, like I'm doing this right now while it's not hot, but kind of remember that you're going to be on the ground next to it, and you're going to be rotating it. So that is the Tower of Power, a constant rotation, and we're just moving that flame around so that we get a good even bake. The next method that I want to talk about is the Twiggy Fire. This is my preferred method of getting a nice even bake. And the way that works, especially with the fry bake, and I've done it on in like the Alpine stoves, or excuse me, the Alpine cook set with the lid on top there. It doesn't work nearly as well, but the fry bake is great. So say I'm baking a cake, birthday cake, or even some flatter breads and things like that, and I've got my nice even rotation going, but I'm not getting the full encompassing like oven effect. So one of the things that you can do is a Twiggy Fire. And basically what that looks like, and we talked about this nice little indentation up here, is that you get a very small amount of sticks. You get small sticks. I would say a little bit, no bigger than a pencil, ideally less than that as a starter. And you make a small fire on top here. And what that does is it evenly spreads out the heat on top as well as the bottom, so that you're baking from both sides just like an oven would at home. You get a nice even bake, especially with cakes and things like that, pies. It just makes for a really nice bread experience. If you're doing cinnamon rolls, it's really going to caramelize the sugars and the sugar and cinnamon mix that you might have on top really, really well. And I've got some photos and things like that of the Twiggy Fire that I'm going to input into it. The grand plan was to do an outside baking demonstration with some of my staff members today, and Albuquerque is 300 and some days of sunshine, but today is not one of those days, so here we go. So that technique number 2, and then the fry bake flip, or just flipping it in general. So 2 reasons why I might want to do this. This might be part of my plan, that I just want to flip it to get a nice even bake on the other side. So say I'm baking a cake, I check it to make sure that everything's doing well. I see that it's the bottom of the cake is really starting to form. We got some setting to the top layer. So a cake is going to bake, mostly, especially if you don't have a Twiggy Fire going, it's going to be baking from the bottom up. So we want to make sure that we bake the top somehow. And one of the ways to do that is a full flip. So with something that would be protecting your hands, I would check to make sure that we got some little bubbles forming on the top there, that the top portion of the cake is starting to set. And then I would full out flip the pan, put it back on there, and let it bake on the other side. Ideally what would happen there is it would full drop down to the lid, and it would bake that way. Sometimes it's not going to, and that's why I mentioned, like, if you have it set really well, that it's not shaking too much, that it's going to hold its shape. If you do flip it over and it doesn't drop all the way down, or if it doesn't drop down at all, it still is going to bake that way. I've had cakes that stick to the pan, and then they end up, if I do a flip, that they do still bake. I've also had cakes that, if it does stick, that's another reason why you open it up, try to check the sides to make sure it's going to pop off there. And you flip it over, and it may or may not burn. Alright guys, so we talked about our flip method, and again that creates like a nice even bake as well. So you can try the Tower of Power, you can try the Tower of Power with a Twiggy Fire, you can try just a Twiggy Fire method. And one of the last techniques I want to talk about really quick is steam baking. I'm not really going to go into it too much, but essentially, especially if you're working with something just like the Alpine 2, or you have a pot that you're working with, creating either getting little foil cupcake cups, cupcake liners, or creating little foil baskets, and then putting your batter in there, whether it's muffins or cupcakes or cake batter. You can put a little bit of water in the bottom there, put your little boats of batter in there, and bake them that way as well. They bake pretty quickly that way, really nice, and they taste great. So, other methods that you can use. One of the last techniques I want to talk about is how to control your stove. So when I'm baking and I have my whisper light going, I'm running it at a very small flame, and I want to make sure when I pressurize this, so I pressurize my fuel canister, I'm only really using 10 to 15 pumps in there. I go ahead and prime the stove, I get it going, and then I release the pressure. After I prime it, I release the pressure by just taking this off, just very slowly. You'll hear the bottle. Really, it's this guy, so here. So got this guy in there. So we pressurize it, we prime the stove, we take the pressure back off, and then get it all back together, and I'm going to pump it maybe 5 to 10 times, 10 to 15 times, depending on the size of the flame. The size of the flame that you're going for and what you're baking. So something with a longer bake time is just going to need a very much lower flame. If you're having trouble controlling the size of your flame, or it's just too hot no matter how small the flame is, I like to use either tent stakes if I have them, but my preferred method is rocks. One, we're going to use these yoga blocks as an example. But one, they allow you to get everything elevated. But another thing that I like about it is that it creates a wall. So we'll say, do it like that. So it creates a nice wall. You can use as many. And one thing that's nice about rocks, or my yoga blocks here, don't use yoga blocks. One thing that's nice about rocks is that you don't have to worry about them burning. They do get a little hot sometimes depending on how long you have things on there, so be careful with that. But they make a great surface. So elevating either with tent stakes or rocks, excellent method to get that heat a little bit farther off. And again, you can get it farther off, and then you can still do your Twiggy Fire on top to make sure you get a good even bake. So I'm going to go through some tips really quick. One of the things that people, especially when you first get into baking, baking outdoors, or baking in general, people want to check on the things that they're baking. Not a great idea, especially, just not a great idea. Mostly because you're releasing all that heat that's stored inside your pan. You want to make sure that stays even as much as possible, so checking on it as little as possible. And just remember, like, baking's fun, and especially if you're making like sweetbreads or breads in general, people are going to eat it no matter if it's a little doughy or not, or if it's a little burnt. Like, you're still going to have some good parts of that you can keep and eat. Like, it's going to be a great experience either way, and if anything, it's a learning experience. All of it's a learning experience. I highly recommend, if you are going to get into baking outdoors, you kind of keep a little bread book so that you document techniques that you used while you were baking, and then try to repeat that recipe and improve upon it, and kind of keep it going and get that really fine-tuned, and then kind of make stepping stones away from there. So another thing, we talked about to flip. If the bottom is getting burnt or things aren't going very well, and you're burning, and even with either the tower or power method, and if you're not doing a Twiggy Fire, you can go ahead and flip it. That's another great time to flip. If you have this style of pan, you can flip it, and hopefully you'll get a better even bake. But again, if you're burning that bottom, try to figure out a way to either lift up the pan either with rocks or with your tent stakes to elevate it a little bit more, or to go ahead and flip it if you can. And another method for flipping is to, especially if the top of that item is already done, or starting to firm up. Say it's a cake and the top is starting to firm, but you're getting too much heat on the bottom and it's starting to burn a little bit. We can try to take it off with some nice heat-resistant pot grips, or like a towel or something. Go ahead and flip it, and if you can get it onto this next one, you can take it off of there, use a spatula, and to put the other side, the little less done side, and move it over into the pan, and then cap it back off and put it back on your fire. People have a tendency to overfill. When you bake, it expands a lot. So especially when you're working with batters and things like that, brownies and cakes, you're going to want to make sure that you don't overfill it. That's a quick way to make a big mess. So don't overfill. And then another one was checking when it's done. I mentioned having a fork with me earlier. I like to give it to see if any of it comes back. So if I think it's done, I'm going to put my fork in. If it comes out and it's nice and clean, all done. Another way to check to see if it's done, especially like cakes, muffins, things like that, cupcakes, giving it a little bit of a push. So put your finger on it and push. If it has a nice like spring back when you take your finger away, done. One of my go-tos, the Knowles Cookery. I'm a Knowles graduate, so I do rep Knowles when I can. I learned a lot from the classes that I took with them, and this book, the Knowles Cookery. This is the 5th edition. I think they're up to like a 7th or 8th. But I highly recommend grabbing one of these if you're interested in cooking in the backcountry. They have a great section on baking both quick breads and yeasted breads. I prefer to cook yeasted breads, but in a pinch, you can make some quick breads really quickly. You can do cinnamon rolls in a flash with some quick bread, and that'll blow some of your friends' minds especially if they're not expecting it and you're up early and you make some make a great breakfast especially after a long previous day. Like that really gets people going, or before a really hard day. But yeah, the Knowles Cookery has some excellent recipes and tips and techniques. So I highly recommend that. Their basic bread recipe, or any basic bread recipe that works well for you at home, but theirs, as far as using it in the backcountry, their basic bread, yeasted and quick bread, is a great starter. So you can, I don't mean like a yeast starter, I mean like a starting point for you to master that and then add stuff to it. So you can make a delicious quick bread, and then you can add make a cinnamon swirl raisin, add nuts to it. You can go savory and do cheeses and herbs and things like that in it too. And it's a lot of it's experimentation. There's some great recipes out there, and I'm going to share the Knowles Cookery. I'll share their quick bread and their yeasted bread recipes, and definitely try them out. And again, once you hone one, that's when you can start to move forward with another one. Some of my personal favorite recipes are based off of those, but I also like to bring other things out into the backcountry that work well for me at home. My pizza dough recipe at home, it's yeasted. It works well for me. I like it has a little bit of cornmeal to it, but it bakes really well, especially deep dish style in a fry bake pan. So I use my own pizza recipes as something that I would use at home. Pumpkin breads, zucchini breads, like those kind of things. I will frequently make those in the backcountry. One thing that's great about yeasted breads is you can make it in the morning and let it rise in your pack all day, or let it rise and knead it again and do a second rise. And you can kind of have that going all day. Some other tips that I'd like to mention is go ahead and, we talked about planning ahead and preparing earlier, but go ahead and have things like your dry ingredients mixed and ready to go prior to setting out. One, it's going to cut down on like the actual time it takes in the backcountry to make it, but it also cuts down on the waste that you have with it. So pre-packaging things prior to setting out. Folks that are into backpacking and things like that probably already do that, but when it comes to baking, it makes things a whole lot easier to go ahead and have things ready to go. I will sometimes, like if I am going out into the backcountry, and I will go ahead and have breads, especially yeasted breads that need to rise, I'll go and have them ready to go so that I can let them rise sometimes overnight, sometimes even overnight into the next day. I have a pizza recipe or pizza dough recipe that I use that I let rise for up to 48 hours to get that really like that almost like beer-like yeasty flavor going. So again, a lot of it's experimentation, but I highly recommend just trying, and there's nothing that says you can't practice your backcountry baking in your backyard. Do it in a safe manner and make sure you get away from your house, but yeah, absolutely. I practice all kinds of recipes, and we even do it here at the shop. So I mentioned earlier that we weren't able to do the backcountry baking the way I wanted to do it, but tomorrow we're going to have a little bake-off here with myself and 2 other staff. Everybody's making different recipes, but we'll see who the other staff like the best. And we'll go ahead and post those on our Instagram account. Definitely follow us if you can at Rec Services. I think it's UNM underscore rec services underscore UNM. But for the most part, that's about it. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I'll put my email address below, and happy baking.